Imagine paying for first class, walking confidently to your seat, and fastening your belt, only to be told you don't belong. Imagine showing your ticket twice, yet the flight attendants hover, questioning, doubting, whispering to one another as if your presence itself is the mistake. What do? Do you quietly move to economy to avoid the stares? Do you argue until your voice breaks? Or do you choose another path? On one ordinary night, aboard a Skyreach flight bound for Dallas, Dr. Adrian Rhodes, a black CEO known for his calm strength, faced that very question. Within minutes, humiliation spread through the cabin, whispers turned to recordings, and the countdown to his removal began. But instead of breaking, Adrian acted with a quiet precision that stunned everyone watching. What happened next didn't just stop one flight. It stopped an entire airline in its tracks. How can one man sitting in 3C bring a billion-dollar company to its knees? What power did he hold in his hands, and what message did he deliver to the world that night? Stay with us as we unfold this gripping, true-to-life drama. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Silent Defenders so you never miss the stories others try to bury. The sliding glass doors of Boston Logan International opened with a soft hiss, spilling a rush of chilled autumn air into the terminal. Travelers poured through the wide entryway with rolling suitcases, hot cups of coffee, and the kind of brisk determination that only airports could summon. Some were chasing deadlines, some were chasing reunions, some were simply chasing escape. Dr. Adrian Rhodes walked among them at a measured pace, his stride steady, unhurried. He carried a single leather case, compact and worn, bearing the scuffs of 1,000 business trips. His navy suit was tailored with quiet precision, its lines crisp but not ostentatious. His tie, a muted burgundy, matched the deliberate calm he projected. On the surface, he was just another passenger bound for Dallas, but Adrian had lived long enough to know that surfaces deceived. His mind tracked every detail, the flicker of eyes that lingered a little longer on his skin, the subtle lift of brows from strangers who glanced at his boarding pass as though needing to reassure themselves he belonged in the premium line. These were micro moments, easy to dismiss, but they formed a familiar script he had been forced to memorize since childhood. At the Skyreach Airlines counter, the agent scanned his digital boarding pass. The machine chirped green. Without looking up, she murmured, "Gate B-22 boarding now." Adrian offered a polite nod and stepped away. He joined the short queue for first class, his case balanced neatly at his side. For a moment, he let himself believe it would be simple. He had paid confirmed and reserved seat 3C weeks ago. He had earned this seat not through luck, but through decades of relentless work, sacrifices that most would never see. The gate opened, and the line began to move. Adrian entered the narrow jet bridge, its metal ribs humming faintly as passengers pulled luggage across ridged flooring. The air smelled of oil and recycled ventilation, a reminder that he was crossing into a space where strangers would live together, suspended above the earth for hours. Inside the cabin, warm amber lighting softened the space. Leather seats gleamed with a citrus polish. The low murmur of boarding filled the air belts clicking, jackets sliding from shoulders, wheels being lifted into overhead bins. A stewardess in a pressed Navy uniform greeted him with the practiced smile of hospitality, but her eyes flicked down at his pass as if seeking assurance, and then back up again. Adrian slipped into 3C. He slid his case under the seat, fastened his belt, and exhaled. The chair's generous width pressed against his shoulders like a reminder that he had carved out this small comfort. He let his eyes close briefly, then reopened them, cataloging the faces around him. Across the aisle, A teenager with oversized headphones already dangled a phone upright, whispering into a live stream. 2 rows ahead, a businessman in a charcoal tie adjusted his cufflinks as though the world were watching. In the very first row, an elderly woman with silver hair carefully tucked a handbag at her feet, her expression serene but watchful. It was ordinary in that way that airports are ordinary strangers stacked together, each carrying hidden stories. Yet beneath that surface, Adrian felt a faint tightening in his chest, an instinct he could never quite shake, the subtle reminder that belonging here was never given freely, only contested. From the forward galley, a tall woman with dark hair pulled tight approached. Her stride was purposeful, her authority radiating through her posture. The badge pinned to her jacket read, Helena Park, Cabin Chief. She stopped at Adrian's row, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "Sir," she said, voice firm but polite. "May I see your boarding document again?" Adrian raised his brows, but handed it over without hesitation. Helena tilted it toward the cabin light, scanning it with narrowed eyes as though searching for an irregularity invisible to anyone else. Her smile returned, but it was thin, perfunctory. "Thank you. Just confirming this is your assigned seat." "It is," Adrian replied evenly. Her gaze lingered a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then she pivoted, moving on, her shoes clicking softly against the carpet. The exchange lasted seconds, but the atmosphere shifted like a tide. Conversations dulled. A man 2 rows ahead cast a glance backward, then quickly forward again, pretending not to notice. Adrian leaned back, folding his hands calmly in his lap. He recognized the pattern. He had seen it in restaurants, in boardrooms, at hotel desks. A challenge framed as procedure, a courtesy masking exclusion. He did not fidget, he did not react. He observed, a memory stirred unbidden. He was 12 years old again, standing outside the iron gates of a country club his father's colleague had taken him to. The chlorine tang of the pool had been sharp in his nose, but sharper still were the words. "Not everyone belongs here," delivered softly, as though that gentleness would blunt their cruelty. The sting of that moment had never left him. And now, decades later, seated in first class with his documents fully in order, Adrian felt the echo of that same sting. He inhaled slowly, exhaled, and waited. From the corner of his vision, he noticed the teenager across the aisle tilt her phone a little higher. The red recording light blinked faintly. Her whisper floated above the murmurs. "They're checking his seat again. He already showed his ticket." Adrian kept his eyes forward, but the awareness settled in. What might have remained unseen, hidden in the folds of routine humiliation, was now being witnessed, streamed, shared, and amplified in real time. The cabin's hum changed. It was no longer just the sound of boarding, it was the sound of anticipation. Adrian Rhodes folded his hands a little tighter, his mind clear. Whatever unfolded next, it would not be the quiet erasure of one man's dignity. It would be something larger. The stage had been set, and though the plane had not yet left the ground, Adrian knew the real journey was about to begin. The final groups of passengers were still trickling into the cabin when Helena Park returned. This time, she was not alone. At her side walked a younger flight attendant, soft-voiced and clearly uncomfortable, her hands clasped nervously in front of her apron. Helena's stance was deliberate, her arms crossed, chin slightly lifted. She stopped in front of row 3 again, as though she were a judge returning to deliver a verdict. "This is seat 3C. Correct." Adrian kept his expression calm, though a thin edge traced his words. "Yes, that is correct." The younger attendant shifted awkwardly. "Perhaps we should," she began, but Helena cut her off. Regulations must be enforced, Helena said crisply. From across the aisle, Naomi Carter angled her phone higher. The red light blinked bright now, catching the faces, the uniforms, the uncomfortable air between them. Her whisper carried just enough to be heard by those nearby. They're checking him again. Same ticket, same seat. This doesn't feel right. The hum of the cabin changed once more. People who had been scrolling through emails or adjusting headrests now paused. Conversations dulled into silence. Eyes flicked toward row 3, cautious but curious. An elderly woman in the front, Margaret Hill, leaned subtly into the aisle. Her lips pressed thin, her eyes narrowing, not at Adrian, but at the staff. She had seen this pattern before, more times than she cared to admit. Meanwhile, the businessman in 2D, Richard Lawson, straightened in his seat. He adjusted his tie, then muttered just loud enough to be overheard. Finally, someone's keeping the standards. These cabins aren't for everyone. The words carried like a spark. Adrian heard them, but did not flinch. He remained still, hands resting lightly on the armrests. His stillness a deliberate choice. Helena leaned in closer, her voice lower but tinged with condescension. "Sir, are you certain this is your assigned seat?" Adrian's eyes lifted to meet hers. "Quite certain." Naomi's screen scrolled rapidly. Comments stacked on one another. "This is insane. He's already shown it. Keep recording." The moment stretched. Passengers held their breaths. Helena's jaw tightened. Her authority pressed against the edges of uncertainty, but she did not yield. She gestured toward the rear of the cabin. "Mr. Ortiz, can you confirm?" From the aisle appeared Malcolm Ortiz, the service supervisor. His broad shoulders and measured gait suggested the presence of an arbiter, a man accustomed to resolving disputes. His face, however, carried no warmth. He looked at Adrian, then at the boarding slip, his lips pressed thin. "I'm not convinced either," Malcolm said. The words fell heavy, stirring a fresh ripple of murmurs. Richard Lawson nodded with smug satisfaction, while Margaret Hill exhaled sharply, her dismay audible even 2 rows away. Adrian did not move. But inside, memory surged again. The smell of chlorine at that country club pool. The words that had stung his boyhood skin. "Not everyone belongs here." That same shadow stretched into this moment. But Adrian was not 12 anymore. He was not outside the gate. He was inside, seated firmly in 3C, and he would not surrender it to shadows. A buzz hummed in his pocket. His phone. He ignored it for now. His gaze stayed fixed on the faces before him. Helena folded her arms tighter. "We may need you to move. Regulations are regulations." Before Adrian could answer, a new presence appeared. A uniformed figure stepped into the aisle, radio clipped to his shoulder, his expression weary but firm. Officer Grant Mercer. His voice was flat, rehearsed, stripped of nuance. "Sir," he said, tone official, "you have 60 seconds to comply, or we will escort you out." Gasps stirred through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uneasily. Others pulled out phones to record. Naomi's feed counter jumped by the hundreds, then thousands. Ethan Ward, the journalist seated farther back, angled his phone forward, his voice calm but deliberate as he narrated. "Boston to Dallas. Skyreach flight. 227. Watch closely. A man with a valid ticket is about to be forced from his seat." Adrian inhaled slowly, his breath controlled. He adjusted the cuffs of his jacket with deliberate care. His expression remained unreadable. He did not look at Helena, nor at Malcolm, nor even at the officer now counting softly. 60. 59. He looked at the aisle itself, the narrow corridor that had become an arena. Conversation ceased entirely. The captain's voice over the intercom droned instructions for departure, but no one was listening. Every eye, every lens, every breath in reach of row 3 belonged to this confrontation. Adrian's hand slid into his pocket. His fingers closed around his phone. Officer Mercer's eyes sharpened, anticipating resistance, but Adrian's movements were smooth, without haste, without panic. He drew the device out. The screen glowed faintly, casting pale light on his face. "Just a moment," he said, voice level, quiet enough that listeners had to lean in, yet strong enough to slice through the hush. Helena's jaw locked. Malcolm folded his arms tighter. 58, 57. The officer's countdown continued. Naomi whispered breathlessly into her stream. "He's not moving. They're really counting." Her comments exploded. "This is blatant. Don't let them drag him. We're with him." Adrian's thumb hovered over the phone. His eyes were calm, like a lake before a storm. Margaret Hill in the first row leaned forward, her silver hair catching the light. Her voice, though aged, carried strength. "Leave him be. He has shown his documents more than once. To keep demanding more, well, that reveals the real issue. Doesn't it?" Richard Lawson snapped back instantly, his words sharp. "This is first class. Madam, standards matter. If they don't enforce them, what's next? Anybody sitting wherever they like." His tone dripped entitlement. He straightened, smug, certain he spoke for order, but the cabin bristled. From row 4B, a young mother, Jasmine Lee, cradling her infant, spoke up, voice trembling yet steady. "No, this isn't about rules. We've all watched. He belongs here. You're just looking for an excuse." Helena's face flushed, a brief crack in her composure. She masked it with a stiff nod, then turned to Malcolm. "We can't allow disruption." Malcolm hesitated. His folded arms tightened, but doubt crept across his expression. Finally, he gave a curt nod, not conviction, but reassurance for Helena's sake, more than his own. Adrian remained composed, his phone balanced in his palm. He tapped the edge of the device once, setting it lightly on the armrest. The faint glow illuminated his platinum membership card, tucked discreetly beneath. Naomi's lens caught it, though Helena seemed too focused to notice. Officer Mercer pressed his earpiece, listening to chatter buzzing in his radio. His brows furrowed. Something in the dispatcher's tone made him hesitate. The rhythm of his countdown faltered. 53, 52. Passengers sensed the shift. Whispers spread. Richard Lawson scoffed again, his voice sharp. "Why are we wasting time? Drag him out already." But the murmurs were louder now, voices rising in defense, a tide of dissent swelling against authority. Adrian cleared his throat gently. His words cut the hush with calm resonance. "Apologies for the delay. Everyone. This will resolve shortly." The simplicity disarmed some, irritated others, but undeniably pulled focus back to him. Helena's voice sharpened, her veneer of professionalism cracking. "You don't have the right to address the cabin." Adrian tilted his head, his eyes steady. "And you don't have the right to strip a passenger of dignity." Gasps erupted. Naomi's stream surged, comments flashing so quickly they blurred. Ethan Ward's narration sharpened. "You heard him. That's not protest. That's declaration." The officer's radio crackled louder. Words slipped through. Fragments not meant for passengers' ears. Delays. System alerts. Irregularities. Mercer's posture stiffened. He glanced back toward the cockpit, then at Helena. For the first time, his certainty faltered. The standoff deepened. Phones tilted higher. Hearts beat faster. The stage of Skyreach 227 had shifted from inconvenience to crucible. And Adrian Rhodes, still seated in 3C, remained unshaken. his calm presence pressing against the cabin like a force no uniform, no badge, no clipboard could silence. The tension inside the cabin was a living thing now. It pulsed through the recycled air, vibrating in the nervous tapping of shoes, the tight grips on armrests, the sharp intakes of breath. The officer's countdown ticked on, though unevenly now, as if even he felt the weight of what he was enforcing. Helena Park stood rigid, clipboard clutched like a shield, her jaw locked in stubborn defiance. Malcolm Ortiz hovered beside her, arms folded, but his eyes betrayed the fracture lines forming inside him. Adrian Rhodes had not moved except to rest his phone against the armrest. Its glow illuminated the platinum card tucked beneath, a silent reminder that he belonged here as much as anyone. His gaze was steady, his voice calm when he finally broke the silence. "Enough," he said, the single word carrying sharper authority than any shout. The cabin hushed even deeper. Naomi Carter's stream tilted in closer, her hand trembling with adrenaline. Her audience surged past 30,000 comments, firing faster than she could read them. Ethan Ward's narration became a whisper but carried clearly to his microphone. "This is it. He's about to make his move." Adrian tapped his phone screen, slid his thumb across, and lifted it to his ear. The first ring was never finished. A voice answered instantly, crisp, professional, as though waiting for this exact call. "Road Systems Command, authorization, please." Adrian's tone did not waver. "Red code, 17. Execute." Helena blinked. Malcolm stiffened. Officer Mercer froze mid-count. To them, the phrase meant nothing, but the certainty with which it was spoken unsettled them more than if he had shouted threats. Passengers leaned forward instinctively, their confusion palpable. Naomi's audience exploded with speculation. What's red code did he just call in a strike? Is this military? Ethan Ward's voice sharpened, broadcasting to millions. That wasn't bluff. That was precision. The line on Adrian's phone clicked again. The woman's voice returned, calm but grave. Command acknowledged. Sequence initiated. Almost instantly, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, controlled but strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to a systems complication, our departure will be delayed. Please remain seated until further notice." Gasps and murmurs swept through the rows. Richard Lawson, the smug businessman in 2D, twisted in his seat. "What is this? I have connections in Dallas. I won't sit here." While his voice faltered as Officer Mercer's radio buzzed violently with urgent chatter. Words slipped out over the static. "Ground stop. Terminals unresponsive. All flights affected." Mercer's eyes widened fractionally before he masked them again. He backed a step away from Adrian without realizing it, as though the man in 3C had become untouchable. Helena felt the ground shifting beneath her heels. She had prepared herself for arguments, for anger, even for resistance she could categorize neatly as disorderly. But this was control wrested from her hands without force, without raised voice, with nothing more than a code spoken into a phone. Naomi whispered breathlessly. He shut something down. He really did. Her screen counter surged again, cresting 50,000, the comments blurring with shock and awe. Adrian lowered the phone and set it carefully back on the armrest. His movements were precise, calm, deliberate, as though he were in a boardroom rather than a cabin about to erupt. Margaret Hill leaned forward from 1A, her silver hair gleaming in the overhead lights. Her voice carried softly but firmly. "You're not just another passenger, are you?" Adrian inclined his head slightly, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement. He turned his gaze toward Richard Lawson, who was fuming in his seat. "What you call inconvenience," Adrian said evenly. "Others call a reckoning." Richard sputtered, but his bluster felt suddenly small against the backdrop of murmurs and gasps. The captain's voice returned, heavier this time. Attention passengers, Skyreach operations are experiencing a temporary ground hold. We appreciate your patience. The edge in his tone betrayed a tension no script could disguise. Phones lit the cabin like scattered stars. Some passengers scrambled to text loved ones only to find connections sluggish, networks jammed. Others simply stared at Adrian, their disbelief shifting into something like awe. Ethan Ward leaned closer to his microphone. You just watched it. A single call, and an airline stopped breathing. This is not coincidence. This is leverage. Helena's fingers twitched around her clipboard. She wanted to demand explanations, to reassert control, but something in Adrian's demeanor told her pressing further would unravel her far more than him. She glanced at Malcolm for reinforcement, but he avoided her eyes. The internal phone near the galley chimed suddenly, its shrill ring slicing through the murmurs. Helena startled. Her hand shook as she lifted it, exchanged a few clipped words, then turned back toward Adrian. Her face had drained of color. Mr. Rhodes, she said, her voice unsteady. There's a call for you. The entire row stiffened. A passenger receiving a direct call through the aircraft system was unheard of. Helena extended the handset like it was a fragile relic. Adrian accepted it with calm fingers and brought it to his ear. His voice was even, carrying just enough volume that those nearby could hear. This is Rhodes. The reply thundered even though it was only one man's voice. Gregory Vaughn, chief executive of Skyreach Airlines. His tone was tight, clipped, carrying the weight of someone whose empire was suddenly fragile. Adrian, it's Vaughn. I assume you know what's happening right now. Passengers within earshot froze. Aria Delgado's stream zoomed in. Naomi's comments exploded. Ethan leaned forward in disbelief. The CEO himself was speaking into the cabin. Adrian did not flinch. Yes, Gregory, your system is at a standstill, and you know exactly why. Vaughn's breath was audible even through the muffled receiver. Do you have any idea what this means? Every gate is paralyzed. Flights are frozen. We are hemorrhaging money by the minute. Adrian's eyes never left Helena, who stood trembling by the galley. I am fully aware. Consider this a demonstration. When those entrusted with service abuse their power, when prejudice dictates access, contracts are breached, and breaches have consequences. Helena's knees nearly buckled. She steadied herself against the wall, hearing words she wished she could unhear. Passengers shifted restlessly, realizing now this was not just a personal conflict, but a corporate reckoning. Even Richard Lawson had gone silent. Vaughn tried to reassert control, his voice sharp. You can't unilaterally pull the plug on a national carrier. The losses will cascade. Government scrutiny will know. Adrian cut him off, calm but surgical. The terms come now, while every eye is watching. Later, you will have excuses. Today, you have accountability. The cabin held its breath. Phones hovered. Every passenger was no longer just a witness, but part of a tribunal. Vaughn's voice dropped lower, desperation creeping into his tone. What do you want? Adrian leaned back, his words deliberate. 3 conditions. First, immediate suspension of the crew member who initiated this, pending investigation. Second, mandatory training for all staff, not a video, but education measured by results. Third, an independent reporting line for discrimination beyond your bureaucracy's reach. Gasps rippled, heads turned instinctively toward Helena. She stood pale and silent, the weight of every passenger's gaze burning her. Vaughn exhaled harshly. And if we don't comply, Adrian opened his laptop, the glow lighting his calm face. On the screen, Words sharp as a blade appeared: termination of service agreement. He pressed a key, turning the screen slightly so those nearby could glimpse the language. Then your airline has less than a month to replace its booking infrastructure. You and I both know that's impossible without bleeding billions. The air inside the cabin shifted like pressure before a storm. Ethan Ward's commentary sliced clear. There it is. He controls the backbone of their reservations. He isn't threatening. He's stating fact. Gregory Vaughn faltered. Background noise poured through the line. Voices shouting, papers rustling, the chaos of a war room unraveling. His reply was hoarse. You'll have the agreement. Within the hour? Adrian inclined his head slightly. Good, but remember, this is not victory. This is your test. Whether your company changes or collapses is entirely in your hands. The line went silent a moment. Then Vaughn's voice returned subdued. It will be done. Adrian lowered the handset and placed it gently back on the cradle. The click of its return was louder than it should have been. For a moment, silence ruled. Then passengers began clapping softly, uncertainly at first, then more firmly. The applause was not raucous, but reverent, as though they knew they were not just applauding a man, but a turning point. Adrian lifted a hand slightly, enough to still the sound. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but carried to every ear. Do not mistake this for triumph. It is only the beginning. What matters is whether they learn. If they don't, then this was only theater. And I have no interest in theater. Every passenger absorbed the words like stone absorbing weight. Ethan Ward whispered into his microphone. He is not playing to the gallery. He is using the stage to change the script. Naomi's phone shook as she whispered into her stream. He forced the CEO to terms right here, while we all sat watching. The storm Adrian had unleashed was no longer confined to Skyreach 227. It was already echoing far beyond the fuselage, and every soul in that cabin knew they were part of something that would not be forgotten. The applause faded into a tense, thoughtful quiet. What had just unfolded was unlike anything most passengers had ever seen. They had come expecting a flight, a routine crossing of states. Instead, they had stumbled into a reckoning suspended 30,000 feet above the earth. Adrian Rhodes sat as though he had done nothing remarkable, his phone resting in his hand, his expression composed. His breathing was even, his posture calm, but there was a gravity around him now that no one could ignore. The cabin felt less like a vessel of travel and more like a courtroom. Helena Park remained near the galley, her clipboard dangling uselessly at her side. For years she had lived by procedure, by the security of checklists and the shield of regulations. Yet in this moment her authority felt paper-thin. She glanced at Malcolm Ortiz, hoping for reinforcement, but his eyes were lowered, fixed on the carpet. He folded his arms, but the gesture felt more like self-defense than command. Richard Lawson could not stay silent. His voice pierced the hush, brittle and indignant. This is outrageous. We can't just let one passenger hijack an entire airline because he feels slighted. His words carried the strain of a man whose certainties were crumbling. What precedent does this set that anyone can? His protest was cut short by Margaret Hill. The elderly woman rose slowly from her seat in the first row, her silver hair glowing in the cabin lights. Her voice was steady, firm, carrying the weight of decades. The precedent, she said, is that when a man shows his documents 3 times and is still treated as though he does not belong, something is wrong. The precedent is that dignity should not be optional. A murmur of agreement rippled through the rows. Jasmine Lee, the young mother cradling her infant, spoke next, her voice soft but unwavering. I watched him do everything right. He was polite. He complied, and still, they tried to remove him. If it can happen to him, it can happen to anyone. Richard's face flushed red, but his arguments faltered. The tide of the cabin had turned against him. Naomi Carter's phone captured every word, her viewers firing comments faster than she could read them. This is history. She's right. Witnesses matter. Ethan Ward adjusted his mic, his voice crisp as he narrated. The cabin has become a tribunal. Voices once silent are now speaking. A businessman's protest is drowned by the testimony of those who have seen too much. Helena finally moved, stepping forward with effort. Her face was pale, her composure cracked. She looked directly at Adrian, her voice trembling. I may have misjudged. I didn't mean. She stopped, swallowing hard, her throat tightening. I was enforcing procedure. I never intended to humiliate you. Adrian studied her, his eyes calm but piercing. For a long moment he said nothing, and the silence itself became an answer. Then he spoke, his voice low but firm, every word deliberate. Intent does not erase outcome. You may not have meant humiliation, but that does not make it vanish. What matters is not what you intended, but what was done. Helena lowered her gaze. The weight of his words pressed into her chest. For the first time in years, she felt stripped of the uniform's authority. She was simply a person, fallible, exposed. Adrian turned then, addressing not Helena, but the cabin. His voice carried evenly, steady as stone. This was never about a seat. Seats can be reassigned, schedules rebooked. This is about what happens when dignity is treated as negotiable, when systems designed to serve instead become weapons of exclusion. Every passenger listened. Even Officer Grant Mercer, still stationed awkwardly in the aisle, found himself unable to look away. Adrian's words continued, measured but resonant. Some of you may believe this was overreach, that I pulled too much weight, that one phone call should not be able to halt an airline. Perhaps you're right. But ask yourself, what does it take for the voiceless to be heard? If a man with resources must leverage the backbone of a corporation simply to claim the seat he paid for, what chance does the ordinary traveler have? The questions hung heavy in the recycled air. Naomi's chat scrolled in frantic agreement. Ethan whispered, he isn't just speaking to them, he's speaking to the country. Richard Lawson slumped back into his seat, his protest shriveled. Helena stood silent, her eyes glistening with the weight of realization. Malcolm exhaled slowly, as though the truth he had been avoiding had finally pressed itself upon him. Adrian leaned back, his tone softening, though the strength beneath it remained. This is not revenge. I am not here to humiliate anyone. Reform is the goal, not retribution. But reform cannot begin until accountability is faced, and accountability cannot hide behind intent. Margaret Hill nodded slowly. Her lips pressed tight in agreement. Jasmine adjusted her infant, whispering softly as though to herself, yes, reform, not revenge. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, his tone steadier now. Ladies and gentlemen, Skyreach operations are working with us to resolve the matter. Thank you for your patience. His words were formal, but there was a subtle shift respect where before there had been only distance. Naomi lowered her phone briefly, her face flushed with awe. He's changing everything right here in front of us. She whispered it almost to herself, but the stream carried it to tens of thousands. Ethan closed his eyes a moment, listening to the hush that followed Adrian's words. When he spoke again, his commentary was hushed but firm. What you're witnessing is more than confrontation. It is the architecture of justice being built in real time, calmly, methodically, without anger, yet with undeniable force. Adrian folded his hands lightly in his lap once more. His voice dropped to a near whisper, though every ear leaned in to catch it. This is not theater. This is testimony. And testimony only matters if witnesses speak. The cabin exhaled collectively. A fragile silence, but not the silence of fear, rather. The silence that follows truth when words have landed and no one dares disturb them. Helena shifted again, her voice low, almost inaudible. What do I do now? Adrian's gaze softened, but his reply was steady. You learn, you change, and then you teach others not to repeat what you did. That is the only redemption available. Her throat tightened. She nodded faintly, though shame burned hot on her cheeks. Malcolm finally looked up, his arms uncrossing. His voice was hoarse, but honest. He's right. We should have known better. Richard muttered something under his breath, but it was lost in the swell of agreement from others. The tribunal in the cabin had reached its conclusion. The jury was not 12 men in a box, but dozens of strangers in a fuselage, bound together by the common witness of injustice. And in the center of it all, Adrian Rhodes remained unshaken. He had not raised his voice. He had not left his seat. Yet he had shifted the ground beneath an entire corporation. The plane had not moved an inch from Boston, yet every passenger knew they had already traveled somewhere they could never return from. The cabin of Skyreach 227 felt like a room where time itself had paused. The hum of the air system continued. The lights glowed a steady amber, but every passenger knew they were inside a suspended moment, something larger than themselves. The tribunal had ended, yet the aftermath was only beginning. Adrian Rhodes leaned back slightly, his hands folded loosely in his lap. He had spoken his truth, but his mind did not rest. Behind his calm exterior, thoughts churned. He remembered his father's words from years ago, spoken outside a country club that had denied him entry. They'll let you succeed, son, as long as you don't step where they've decided you don't belong. That echo returned now, resonating with every syllable he had just uttered in the cabin. Officer Grant Mercer remained near the cockpit door, his stance uncertain. He had been trained to enforce compliance, to remove disruption swiftly and without question. Yet what he had witnessed unsettled him. The passenger in 3A had not been unruly. He had not shouted, threatened, or disobeyed. He had complied with every request until the requests themselves became absurd. Mercer's countdown still echoed in his ears, each number a reminder of how close he had come to becoming complicit in humiliation. His hand brushed the metal cuffs at his belt, and for the first time in his career, they felt heavy. Helena Park had retreated to the galley, her hands gripping the counter. She kept her back to the passengers, but her reflection in the metal cabinet betrayed her turmoil. She had always believed professionalism was her shield, yet tonight it had cracked, exposing her prejudice to dozens of witnesses. She replayed Adrian's words, "Intent does not erase outcome." The sentence cut deeper than any reprimand she had received in her career. Malcolm Ortiz sat stiff in his jump seat, staring at the floor. He thought of all the times he had looked the other way, hiding behind the excuse of rules. He knew now that his silence had been more damaging than confrontation. And though Adrian's words had not been directed solely at him, he felt pierced by them. The passengers began to talk among themselves, their voices low but insistent. Margaret Hill leaned toward Jasmine Lee, her tone steady. "I never thought I'd see it happen again, not in my lifetime. But prejudice has a way of reinventing itself." Jasmine nodded, bouncing her baby gently. "I was scared at first, but then I realized if we don't speak up, it just keeps going." Richard Lawson sat silently now, his earlier protests shrinking under the weight of collective disapproval. He fiddled with his cufflinks, avoiding the eyes of those around him. The businessman who once spoke with certainty now looked small, diminished. Naomi Carter lifted her phone again, her live stream audience climbing into 6 figures. She whispered into the lens, "It's quiet now, but don't mistake it for over." He shut them down without raising his voice. "I think this is just the beginning." Comments poured across her screen. "He's brilliant. This will go viral. History in real time." Ethan Ward scribbled notes in his leather-bound journal, even as his mic picked up his hushed commentary. "What fascinates me most," he said softly, "is not just the confrontation itself, but the aftermath. You can feel the recalibration happening inside this cabin. Strangers are processing, rewriting what they thought they knew about order, power, and fairness." Adrian glanced toward the window, his reflection faint in the glass. His calm face belied the current running through his thoughts. He did not crave the spotlight. He had never sought public theater. Yet he understood the truth. Moments like this were rare, and if wasted, they faded into nothing more than anecdotes. He could not allow that. He owed it to everyone who had ever been silenced in a seat they had paid for. The captain's door opened slightly. He stepped into the aisle, his expression drawn. "Mr. Rhodes," he said quietly, "I don't have the authority to make promises, but I want you to know I heard everything. What you said, what was done. For what it's worth, I apologize. This was not how anyone should be treated." Adrian inclined his head, his reply steady. "Your voice matters more than you know. A captain's silence can endorse injustice, but your acknowledgement breaks that silence." The captain nodded once, visibly moved, before retreating into the cockpit. Officer Mercer took a hesitant step forward. His voice was low, almost reluctant. "Sir, earlier, I nearly removed you. I followed procedure because that's what I've been taught. But seeing what's happened, I realize procedure isn't always right. I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Passengers stirred, surprised by the admission. It was rare to hear security apologize mid-flight. Adrian studied Mercer with calm eyes. Acknowledgement is the first step. What you do with that awareness will determine the rest. Remember, silence and obedience can be as harmful as the act itself. Mercer nodded, the words cutting deeper than any reprimand he had ever received from a superior. Helena emerged slowly from the galley, her face pale but resolute. Her voice trembled, yet she forced herself to speak. "I don't expect forgiveness tonight, but I can promise this: I won't forget what happened here, and I won't allow myself to hide behind procedure again." The cabin was silent, listening. Adrian gave a single nod. "Then begin with that. Acknowledge, learn, and change." The atmosphere shifted again. Passengers exchanged glances, some relieved, others contemplative. They were no longer just witnesses to injustice. They were participants in transformation. Naomi's live stream counter flashed higher. "You're seeing it," she whispered to her audience. "Not just a fight, not just a shutdown. This is reform happening in real time." Ethan's pen scratched furiously across the page. He looked up, whispering into his mic. "This is no longer a story about one man versus an airline. It is about the systems that empower bias. It is about the choices we all make when confronted with injustice. And it is about whether acknowledgement can truly lead to change." Adrian closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. For a moment, his mind drifted inward, away from the cabin. He thought of his daughter, age 9, who had once asked him why people stared at them in certain restaurants. He had answered softly then, because sometimes people confuse difference with danger. He wondered how long before she would face a moment like this herself, and the thought both pained and steeled him. When he opened his eyes, the cabin was still watching. Every face seemed to lean toward him, waiting for the next word. But Adrian chose silence. Sometimes silence, held with dignity, spoke louder than speeches. The engines hummed faintly, but still the plane did not move. The airline systems remained suspended, their heartbeat halted by the code he had activated. Outside, the ground crew waited for instructions, while inside, an invisible court of conscience weighed its verdict. Helena took her seat at last, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Malcolm exhaled, his voice breaking the silence. "We should have stopped before it reached this point," Adrian replied softly. "Yes. But acknowledgement means you still can stop it from happening again." The tribunal had ended, but its aftershocks spread through the fuselage like tremors. Each passenger carried their own reflections, their own realizations. Some felt shame, others felt vindicated, many simply felt changed. And though Skyreach 227 still sat idle on the runway, every soul aboard knew they had already departed from where they began. The cabin phone rang again, its sharp chime slicing through the uneasy quiet. Heads turned instinctively, passengers shifting in their seats, eyes narrowing toward the galley where Helena Park startled at the sound. For a heartbeat she hesitated, her hand hovering over the receiver as if it might burn her. Then, with a deep breath, she lifted it to her ear. Her face paled almost instantly. She turned stiffly, scanning the aisle until her gaze fell on Adrian Rhodes in 3A. "Mr. Rhodes," she said, her voice brittle, "there's a call for you." The words were strange enough to draw murmurs. A passenger receiving a direct call through the plane's internal line. That was unheard of. Phones connected to crew, to cockpit, to ground, never to passengers. Yet Helena walked down the aisle, each step heavier than the last, and handed Adrian the receiver as though it were a sacred object. Adrian accepted it calmly, resting the cord against his palm, pressing the handset to his ear. His tone was even, composed. "This is Rhodes." On the other end came a voice taut with tension, clipped with authority but edged with desperation. "Adrian, this is Gregory Hale, the CEO of Skyreach Airlines." His voice carried weight, the kind that commanded boardrooms, stockholders, regulators, but now it was laced with unease. Adrian's expression didn't change. "Gregory, I assume you know what's happening. You've frozen my airline." Hale snapped, though his voice betrayed strain.
"Do you have any idea what this means? Every departure gate is at a standstill. Flights across the network are halted. We're hemorrhaging money by the minute." "I am fully aware," Adrian replied, his tone steady. "Consider it a demonstration, a reminder of what happens when power is abused under the mask of procedure." Passengers leaned closer. Those in the first rows could hear Hale's voice bleeding faintly through the receiver, enough to recognize the panic. Those farther back sensed it from the shift in atmosphere. Naomi Carter angled her phone, whispering into her live stream, "You're hearing it right now. The CEO himself. This is no bluff." In the rear, Ethan Ward's pen scratched furiously against his journal. His mic caught his quiet narration. "The confrontation has climbed higher than this cabin. It now stretches into corporate command." Gregory Hale tried to steal his voice. "You can't unilaterally pull the plug on a national carrier. Do you understand the lawsuits? The government intervention this will trigger." Adrian's reply was surgical. "Gregory, contracts exist for a reason. When they are breached, consequences follow. What happened to me tonight was not a clerical mistake. It was an act of exclusion, and I won't allow silence to bury it." Helena's chest tightened. She knew those words were aimed at her actions, but they carried weight beyond her. The entire industry hung in the balance. Passengers murmured louder. Margaret Hill leaned forward, whispering fiercely. "He's telling them what none of us ever could. That dignity matters more than their schedules." Hale's breath rasped audibly over the line. He lowered his voice as though trying to regain composure. "What do you want?" Adrian held the handset slightly away, his eyes sweeping the cabin. His words were steady, clear enough for those seated nearby to hear. 3 conditions. Naomi's live stream exploded with comments. He's laying down terms. "This is unreal." Adrian leaned back slightly, pressing the handset closer. First, immediate suspension of the crew member who initiated this, pending full investigation. Second, mandatory education for every front-facing employee, not a video module to click through, but measurable training with outcomes tracked. Third, an independent line of reporting for discrimination complaints, outside your bureaucracy's ability to bury. Gasps rippled through the rows. Passengers turned instinctively toward Helena Park, whose face drained of color. Malcolm Ortiz looked down at his folded hands, his silence screaming complicity. On the line, Gregory Hale faltered. The noise of voices rose in his background, executives scrambling, lawyers shouting, a war room unraveling. "That's a tall order," he said finally, "and if we don't comply..." Adrian opened his laptop, the glow casting pale light across his features. He tapped a few keys, then tilted the screen slightly so passengers nearby could see. Bold language stretched across the display, "Termination of service agreement." "Then your airline has less than a month to replace the backbone of your booking infrastructure," Adrian said calmly. "We both know that's impossible without bleeding billions. Compliance is not a choice. It's survival," Naomi whispered breathlessly to her stream. "Oh my God, he owns the system they run on. He's not threatening. He's just stating fact." Ethan leaned closer into his mic. There it is, the hammer. He is not simply a wronged passenger. He is the architect of the system keeping this airline alive. The businessman, Richard Lawson, shifted uncomfortably in 2B. His earlier arrogance had dissolved. Now he looked at Adrian with wide eyes, realizing the magnitude of what he had dismissed as entitlement. Hale's voice cracked through the receiver. "You'll have the agreement." Within the hour, Adrian inclined his head, though Hale couldn't see. "Good. But understand this isn't about appeasement. It's about change that endures once the cameras turn away. If you deliver symbols without substance, the system will remain at my mercy." The CEO's breath rattled through the line. "It will be done," he muttered. Adrian lowered the receiver gently onto the cradle. The click was louder than it should have been, like the gavel of a verdict. For a moment, silence filled the cabin. Then, slowly, scattered applause broke out. It wasn't celebratory, but reverent, cautious, as if passengers knew they were applauding not a man, but a moment. Margaret Hill's hands trembled as she clapped. Jasmine Lee smiled through tears, her baby stirring in her arms. Even Malcolm raised his head, eyes reflecting something closer to respect. Helena stood frozen, her mind spinning. Adrian had not demanded her firing. He had insisted she become the first to undergo training and then instruct others. That decision landed heavier than dismissal. Redemption, she realized, was more crushing than punishment. Naomi whispered into her phone, "He just dictated terms to the CEO. Lev, right here in the cabin. This isn't just a flight delay. This is history." Ethan scribbled one final note, his voice measured as he spoke into his recorder. "We've watched power redistribute itself tonight, not with shouting, not with force, but with calm precision. The passenger in 3A has turned humiliation into a lever for systemic reform, and we are all witnesses. Adrian folded his laptop closed, resting his hands lightly on the tray table. His eyes swept the cabin once more. He did not bask in the attention, nor lean into triumph. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low, but carried to every corner. Do not mistake this for victory. This is only the beginning. What matters is whether they learn. If they don't, then this was theater, and I have no interest in theater. The hush returned, thick with awe. Even Richard Lawson, who had sneered hours earlier, kept his eyes lowered, shame etched across his face. The engines outside remained idle, but inside Skyreach 227 history had already taken flight. The air inside the cabin felt different now, as though the oxygen itself had thickened with meaning. The engines outside remained cold and silent, but no one cared about departure anymore. Conversations rippled unevenly, bursts of whispers followed by long silences. People were trying to process what they had just seen, a man in seat 3A negotiating directly with the CEO of a national airline, dictating terms that would change not only this flight, but perhaps the entire company. Helena Park stood near the galley, her back pressed against the counter. The adrenaline that had fueled her earlier certainty had drained, leaving only trembling hands and a racing heart. She had told herself she was simply following procedure, protecting order in the cabin. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the truth. She had seen Adrian Rhodes and, without meaning to admit it, had judged him by something other than his boarding pass. Now she stood exposed before a cabin full of witnesses. Her eyes flicked toward Adrian. He sat calmly, hands folded on the tray table, posture upright. His presence unsettled her, not because of power, but because of control. He had refused to be rattled even when threatened with handcuffs. He had spoken softly while dismantling her authority. And now, even after securing compliance from her CEO, he sat without triumph. That calm frightened her more than anger would have. Beside her, Malcolm Ortiz shifted uncomfortably. He was a man who had always hidden behind policy. To him, rules had been a shield, follow them, and no one could accuse him of bias. But now he realized how brittle that shield was. Rules written vaguely, enforced selectively, were not protection. They were weapons. And tonight, in front of hundreds of witnesses, he had chosen the wrong side. He spoke quietly, almost to himself. We should have stopped before it reached this point. The words were soft, but passengers near the galley heard. A mother in row 4B, rocking her baby against her shoulder, turned toward him. Her voice was gentle, but carried weight. Acknowledgement matters. At least you said it now. Malcolm swallowed, his throat dry. His eyes found Adrian, who looked back without malice, only steady recognition. Acknowledgement is the first step, Adrian said softly. Change begins when someone admits the mistake. The sentence cut deeper than any reprimand could. Malcolm lowered his gaze, ashamed but strangely grateful for the clarity. In the front row, Margaret Hill leaned into the aisle, her silver hair gleaming under the cabin lights. Her voice was clear, strong, unafraid. I've lived long enough to see how silence keeps doors closed. Tonight we saw the opposite. Someone refused silence, and the door cracked open. A few passengers nodded, their faces solemn. Others whispered their own stories quietly, as if emboldened to speak of moments when they had been doubted or dismissed. Naomi Carter lowered her phone for the first time since the ordeal began. She scrolled through a storm of comments, thousands of viewers thanking her for not looking away, others begging for interviews, news outlets tagging her account. She whispered to herself, "I thought I was just recording for my friends.
I didn't know the whole world would watch." Her hands shook, but she held the phone tighter, knowing she had captured a record no executive could bury. Richard Lawson sat rigid in 2B, his earlier arrogance completely dissolved. Hours ago, he had sneered about standards and order. Now he stared at his knees, unable to lift his gaze. He muttered faintly, almost too soft to hear. "I was wrong." The words weren't for anyone else, just a quiet confession into the silence. Adrian leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. His voice was low, steady, carrying without effort. "What happened here is not about me. It's about what every person deserves when they walk into a place of service respect without conditions." No one interrupted. Even those who had been skeptical earlier sat mute, unwilling to challenge the authority in his tone. Ethan Ward, the journalist, lifted his recorder again. His words came quietly, but they were deliberate, crafted for the unseen audience who would one day read them. Notice how he frames it, not as a personal victory, but as a principle. That's the difference between revenge and reform. Helena flinched at the word reform. She understood now that she had become part of his example. He had not demanded her firing. Instead, he had required her to learn to teach others, to become the embodiment of accountability. That responsibility felt heavier than any punishment could have. Her throat tightened, but she forced herself to whisper aloud, I was wrong." The cabin gasped. Passengers turned to stare at the woman who had started the confrontation. Her voice cracked, but she continued. "I thought I was protecting order, but I was protecting my own bias. I see it now." Adrian turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes. His reply was not cruel, but it was unflinching. "The problem is never intent, Ms. Park. It's outcome, good intentions that harm still wound. Acknowledgement is the first step. What you do with it will define your future." Helena nodded weakly, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. She whispered, "Then I'll learn." The passengers absorbed her words in silence. For them, the spectacle had shifted from confrontation to transformation. They were no longer just watching a man demand justice. They were watching an adversary become a student. Adrian leaned back again, folding his hands together. He did not smile. His composure was not triumph, but resolve. Systems only shift when consequences outweigh the comfort of staying the same. He said evenly, "Today, you've all seen what consequence looks like." Phones lifted again, but this time the tone was different. People weren't just documenting conflict, they were capturing the possibility of change. The businessman in 2B, perhaps unable to sit silent any longer, muttered bitterly, "So what now? Do you run the airline?" His attempt at sarcasm fell flat, drawing disapproving glances from nearby passengers. Adrian's gaze settled on him. Calm, steady, but not hostile. "No, I remind the airline who it truly serves. Without passengers, there is no industry. Without trust, there is no brand. Power without accountability is only illusion." The remark silenced Richard completely. He turned his face toward the window, shame burning in his cheeks. From the cockpit door, the captain emerged, his posture weary but respectful. He paused at row 3A, his voice subdued but sincere. "Mr. Rhodes, I don't know the full scope of what just happened, but I know enough. For what it's worth, I apologize." Adrian inclined his head. "Your job is to fly the plane. Captain, what happened here was never yours to answer for, but what happens next, your silence or your voice, will matter." The captain nodded once, then returned to the cockpit, leaving behind an aisle charged with meaning. Jonas Ward, still recording, spoke softly into his mic. He isn't satisfied with dismantling. He's building. That's the difference between outrage and a movement. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. The weight of the evening pressed against him, but he carried it without bending. For him, the battle had never been about a headline. It was about rewriting the rules of service in real time, forcing accountability into a place where it had been absent for too long. The silence in the cabin was no longer tense. It was contemplative, reverent. Each passenger realized they had been part of something larger than themselves. A lesson disguised as a flight delay. When Adrian opened his eyes again, he looked not at Helena, not at Malcolm, not at Richard, but at the passengers collectively. His voice, steady as always, filled the cabin one last time. Justice does not live in noise. It lives in refusal. One person refusing to be moved can make an entire system shift. The words landed like a benediction. Margaret Hill closed her eyes, whispering softly, "I've waited my whole life to hear that said aloud." Jasmine Lee kissed her baby's forehead, tears sliding down her cheeks. Naomi Carter lifted her phone again, whispering into the stream, "That's the moment. That's the line the world will remember." And Adrian Rhodes leaned back into his seat, eyes steady, knowing the story was no longer his alone. It belonged to every witness who refused to look away. The cabin of Skyreach 227 was silent, but outside the fuselage, the world had already begun to roar. Naomi Carter's live stream, once a quiet feed watched by a handful of friends, now glowed with 6 figures. Comments streamed so quickly they blurred into a waterfall of outrage, support, and disbelief. News outlets had begun embedding her video directly into their websites. Reporters were tagging her handle in frantic attempts to verify details. The world was watching, and the passengers were realizing they were no longer anonymous witnesses. They were part of evidence. Naomi lowered the phone into her lap for a moment, her chest rising quickly. She whispered to herself, "What if I did something wrong? What if this hurts me later?" Her hand shook as she scrolled. Messages from strangers filled her screen. "Thank you for showing this. You saved him from being erased. Stay strong. The world is with you." The words steadied her. She lifted the phone again, tilting the lens back toward Adrian Rhodes, whose calm face had become the center of a storm. Adrian sat unmoved, though he was fully aware of the reach Naomi had given his stand. He had not planned for this to become global theater. His goal had been simple: to refuse humiliation and to force accountability. Yet he knew the truth. Leverage grows when the right witness amplifies it. Now that amplification was beyond anything he could control. Ethan Ward sensed it too. He scribbled furiously into his journal, capturing not just words, but the pulse of the moment. Into his microphone he said softly, "We are no longer passengers bound for Dallas. We are actors on a stage none of us auditioned for, and the curtain has been lifted not just here, but across the country." Margaret Hill nodded quietly, though the comment hadn't been directed at her. She leaned toward Jasmine Lee and whispered, "I've seen marches, court cases, protests, but this A-plane cabin as a courtroom, no one could have imagined it." Jasmine clutched her infant tighter. "I want my son to grow up in a world where people don't have to fight just to sit where they belong." Helena Park sat rigid, staring at her folded hands. Every fiber of her body wanted to retreat, to hide, to find a corner where no one could see her shame. But she couldn't, not anymore. She heard the clicks of cameras, saw the gleam of phones catching every flicker of her expression. She understood now that her mistake wasn't a private misstep. It had become a symbol, and symbols carried consequences. Malcolm Ortiz remained in his jump seat, his mind restless. He remembered training sessions he had signed off on over the years, quick seminars about customer service, compliance checklists, nothing that had ever asked him to confront his own biases. He saw the flaw clearly now. Training that never reached the heart produced staff that never changed. And tonight, he was the proof. Richard Lawson shifted uneasily in his seat, aware of eyes darting toward him. Earlier, he had been loud, eager to enforce boundaries. Now he shrank under the realization that he too was part of the narrative Naomi was broadcasting to the world. He muttered, "I'll be on 100 phones tomorrow if this goes public." His voice was bitter, but beneath the bitterness was fear. Adrian finally broke the silence, his voice calm but resonant. "You should all know something. The power I used tonight, it came with a cost. Contracts like the one I built for this airline don't give me leverage without consequences. If I had pressed harder, I could have collapsed more than their booking system, but that would hurt not just executives, it would hurt staff, families, ordinary people with no say in these decisions." The passengers leaned in. His words weren't defensive. They were explanation, almost confession. "I carry that weight," Adrian continued, "because leverage isn't just a weapon, it's responsibility, and responsibility demands restraint. Remember that when you think power solves everything, it only solves what it has the discipline not to destroy." The cabin hushed deeper. Naomi's audience erupted online. "He's not just powerful, he's responsible. This is leadership. This is how you hold power without letting it poison you." Ethan whispered into his mic, his tone reverent. Notice what he does. He could revel in victory. Instead, he reframes power as burden. That distinction is the heartbeat of true leadership. Officer Grant Mercer, still near the cockpit, lowered his eyes. The weight of his earlier countdown echoed in his ears. 59, 58. Each second now felt like a stain. He stepped forward slowly, speaking into the hush. "Mr. Rhodes, I nearly made the wrong choice. If you hadn't held firm, I'd have dragged you out. And if Naomi hadn't streamed it, maybe no one would have believed you. I'll carry that with me." Adrian looked at him steadily. "Then carry it forward. Use it to stop the next injustice before it needs an audience." Mercer nodded once, a promise forming silently between them. The captain's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're coordinating with ground operations. We don't yet have clearance to depart. Please remain seated." His tone was composed, but passengers caught the strain beneath it. Everyone understood what wasn't said. The airline was scrambling. In corporate offices miles away, executives were huddled in conference calls, scrambling to draft the documents Adrian had demanded. Lawyers argued over liability, PR teams debated statements, and through it all, Gregory Hale's voice thundered, demanding that compliance be immediate. The entire weight of the airline bent toward one demand from a single passenger. Naomi turned her camera back to herself. Her voice trembled, but she spoke with conviction. "For everyone watching, you need to understand we didn't just see a man defend himself. We saw the system blink. We saw accountability forced into the open. And if it can happen here, maybe it can happen everywhere." Her chat exploded with encouragement. Ethan scribbled one final line, "Witnesses matter most when they refuse to look away." Helena pressed her palms together tightly, her thoughts racing. She thought of the staff under her supervision, the policies she had enforced, the countless times she had told herself she was being neutral. But neutrality, she saw now, had always tilted one way. And neutrality had led her here, into the harshest light she had ever faced. She whispered under her breath, almost a prayer, "Let me do better. Let me not waste this." Adrian closed his eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. Fatigue pressed against his shoulders. Leverage was not light. It weighed on him like stone. But he carried it with the steadiness of a man who had long ago accepted that the path to change was paved with burdens. When he opened his eyes again, he caught Margaret Hill's gaze. She smiled faintly, as if to say she understood. The cabin remained grounded in Boston, yet every soul aboard knew they had already traveled far. Their stories were now woven into a narrative larger than any of them had expected, and outside, the world waited breathlessly for what would happen next. The hum of the aircraft's ventilation filled the cabin with a steady background drone, but it could not mask the tension that clung to every seat. The passengers on Skyreach 227 had witnessed the impossible. Already a man halt an airline with a few measured commands. Yet what was about to unfold would carry even heavier weight. Verbal demands could be dismissed later as exaggeration. Written agreements could not. Adrian Rhodes sat in his wide leather seat, hands folded loosely, gaze calm. His laptop rested on the tray table before him, its screen black for the moment. He waited not with impatience, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood that the next move did not belong to him. It belonged to Skyreach itself. Officer Grant Mercer remained near the cockpit door, his posture stiff but changed. He no longer looked like an enforcer waiting for a signal. He looked like a man watching history bend, uncertain of how to tell his children later that he once stood at the edge of a mistake. Naomi Carter's live stream still rolled. The audience counter surged well past 500,000 now. Messages scrolled across the bottom of her screen faster than she could read them. Some were frantic with excitement, others angry, many reverent. Don't stop recording. This is our proof. History in row 3A. Ethan Ward leaned forward in his seat, speaking softly into his recorder. The verbal is giving way to the written. For centuries, power has been contested in courts, in legislatures, in battlefields. Tonight, it is in an airplane aisle. The pen, or the keystroke, remains the instrument of permanence. The cabin phone chimed sharply. Helena Parks startled at the sound, her hand hovering before she lifted the receiver. She listened briefly, then turned toward Adrian, her face pale, her throat dry. They want to speak with you again. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the fear that still clung to her. Passengers leaned forward, hungry to hear what would follow. Adrian accepted the receiver with calm precision. This is Rhodes. Gregory Hale's voice crackled through, clipped and strained. Andrew, it's Hale again. Legal has reviewed your conditions. I'll be blunt, they're not thrilled, but they understand the reality. We'll draft a written commitment now. You'll have it in minutes. Adrian spoke evenly, as though this outcome had always been inevitable. Good.
Ensure the language includes 3 points: suspension of staff pending investigation, comprehensive, measurable training for all public-facing employees, and an independent reporting line for complaints external from your corporate structure. Hale exhaled, the sound harsh against the receiver. It will be done. But Rhodes, you've placed us in an impossible position. Every passenger on this flight is a witness. The press is circling. If you force us to publish this agreement, it becomes precedent. That, Adrian replied calmly, is the point. Precedent is the only shield against repetition. Helena passed him his laptop. The screen came alive in a glow that lit his face. A document appeared within moments, transmitted directly from Skyreach headquarters. Lines of legal text stretched across it, dense with formality, yet unmistakable in its concessions. Passengers near him craned discreetly to glimpse the words. Margaret Hill's silver head tilted slightly, her lips pressed tight. Jasmine Lee leaned forward, her baby sleeping against her chest, whispering to herself, "Please let it be real."
Adrian scrolled carefully, eyes moving with precision. He was not merely reading for content, but for weight. Each clause needed teeth, not loopholes. Each promise needed a measure, not just a gesture. After several minutes, he set his fingers on the keyboard, typing small adjustments. Naomi lifted her phone higher, catching the reflection of the text in the glow. Comments screamed across her feed. He's editing the contract live. This isn't theater. It's a negotiation on record. Skyreach just folded. Richard Lawson groaned quietly in 2B, sinking deeper into his seat. The earlier smugness that had coated his words was gone. He muttered under his breath, "This is going to haunt Wall Street. They'll call it the Rhodes Clause." His voice carried just enough for nearby passengers to hear, earning him sharp looks from Margaret and others. Adrian finished typing, then pressed enter.
The cursor blinked at the bottom of the document. "Send this back to your counsel," he instructed into the phone. "Have Hale sign electronically, here, beneath the final clause." The cabin waited in suffocating silence. 5 minutes passed. Then, the laptop chimed again. A new document appeared. At the bottom, the digital signature read, "Gregory T. Hale, Chief Executive Officer, Skyreach Airlines." Adrian leaned back, the faintest nod of acknowledgement crossing his face. "It's done." The words rippled through the cabin like a wave, first whispers, then audible gasps. Some passengers clapped softly, uncertain whether applause was appropriate in a moment that felt more like a verdict than a victory. Naomi's stream counter soared again, her voice trembling. "You're seeing it with me. It's signed. It's official." He just forced a Fortune 500 airline to change policy mid-flight. Ethan Ward pressed his recorder closer. "Remember this date. Tonight, policy was not written in a boardroom, but in seat 3A. And every one of us became witness to the birth of precedent." Helena lowered into her jump seat, her face flushed with heat and shame. She knew now that every face in the cabin connected her directly to the humiliation that had begun this ordeal. Yet Andrew's decision not to demand her firing, but her retraining, weighed heavier than dismissal could have. She whispered under her breath, "I will not waste this." Malcolm Ortiz finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "Mr. Rhodes, I should have stopped it before it went this far. I didn't, and that failure is mine to own." Adrian turned toward him slowly, his tone steady. "Acknowledgement matters, Mr. Ortiz. Mistakes become anchors only when we refuse to face them. Now you have a choice to let this define you or to use it to transform." Malcolm lowered his eyes, swallowing hard. "Then I will transform." Officer Mercer shifted closer, his radio buzzing faintly. "Headquarters confirmed. Sir, ground operations nationwide are clearing flights again. They're implementing a staggered restart. This cabin may still be delayed, but the system's heart is beating once more." Adrian inclined his head. "Good. That means no one outside this aircraft pays the price for what happened here. Change must never come at the expense of those who had no part in causing harm." Margaret Hill, who had watched silently, finally spoke aloud, her voice carrying an aged authority. "You didn't just win a seat, young man. You reclaimed the dignity of everyone who has ever been told they didn't belong. Don't underestimate what that means." Her words drew quiet nods from several passengers. Even Richard Lawson looked away, unable to meet her eyes. Naomi's stream captured every second. Her audience, now nearing 1 million, flooded with comments. "This will be studied in schools. We'll call it the Rhodes Precedent. Never forget seat 3A. Adrian closed his laptop carefully, folding his hands again. He looked around the cabin, his eyes calm but unyielding. "Remember this," he said softly, yet his voice carried clearly.
Justice is not theater. It is discipline. It is consequence. It is opportunity for those willing to change. Tonight, Skyreach faced consequence. What follows will decide whether it also finds opportunity. The cabin fell silent once more, but it was a silence charged not with fear, but with awe. Each passenger knew instinctively they had been part of something far larger than a disrupted boarding procedure. They had seen power bend, accountability forced, and dignity restored, not in a courtroom or a legislature, but in the narrow aisle of a commercial jet. As the engines outside hummed faintly, signaling the return of clearance, Ethan whispered into his recorder one final line for the night. We boarded a flight to Dallas. We found ourselves instead inside the drafting of history. The engines outside began to spool softly, a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. Clearance had finally come, but no one seemed focused on the journey to Dallas anymore. Every mind in that cabin was still circling the events that had transformed an ordinary flight into a tribunal. Adrian Rhodes sat still, his hands resting loosely on the closed laptop in front of him. His face revealed no triumph, no outward satisfaction, but behind his calm eyes, thoughts turned like gears. He had achieved what he set out to: accountability, written and signed. Yet he felt no victory. Victory was hollow when it came at the cost of exposing how fragile dignity could be. Helena Park sat in her jump seat near the galley, staring down at her trembling hands. She had been humiliated before a cabin full of strangers. The old Helena, the one who relied on authority as armor, might have resented Adrian for dismantling her in public. But tonight, humiliation did not feel like punishment. It felt like revelation. She thought of the young flight attendants she had trained, the time she had reinforced rules without ever questioning whether those rules were fair. She whispered into her palms, "This cannot happen again. Not with me. Not with anyone I teach." Malcolm Ortiz sat across from her, his head bowed. He remembered every moment of silence, every chance he had to intervene, every time he had chosen to fold his arms instead. The shame pressed into him like a weight on his chest. For years he had told himself neutrality was professionalism. Tonight, Adrian had stripped that illusion bare. Neutrality had been complicity. Across the aisle, Richard Lawson's gaze was fixed on the window. The reflection staring back at him was not the proud, confident businessman he thought himself to be. It was a smaller man, one whose arrogance had been shattered by exposure. He remembered the words he had spoken earlier. These cabins aren't for everyone. They now echoed back like a curse. He swallowed hard, realizing how quickly a moment of entitlement could calcify into legacy. People would remember what he had said. Some already had it recorded. Naomi Carter still held her phone aloft. Her audience had swelled beyond anything she could comprehend. News outlets were quoting her feed. Celebrities were resharing it. Hashtags with Adrian's name trended worldwide. She whispered into her microphone, "I never thought I'd be part of something like this. But I think maybe this is why I was here tonight." Her hand trembled, not just from adrenaline, but from the recognition that she was no longer a bystander. She had become a chronicler of history. Ethan Ward closed his leather-bound journal with deliberate care. He leaned back in his seat, eyes closed for a moment, before speaking softly into his recorder.
We live in an age where truth can vanish as quickly as it arrives. Tonight, truth was not erased. It was broadcast, written, signed. The world will argue over the meaning of this night, but it cannot argue that it happened. Adrian finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying across the cabin. Each of you is part of this story now. You did not choose it, but history rarely waits for permission. What you do with the memory of tonight will matter as much as what I did with my leverage. Margaret Hill lifted her chin, her silver hair catching the dim light. Her voice was steady, almost maternal. I will tell my grandchildren that I saw a man remind the world what dignity means. And I will tell them it is never too late to speak when silence would wound. Jasmine Lee clutched her baby closer. Tears shimmered in her eyes.
I'll tell my son, when he's old enough, that I held him during a night when truth was defended, and that he deserves to grow up in a world where no one can take his place from him. The applause that followed was not loud. It was soft, reverent, like the quiet clapping in a church when a sermon lands deep. Even Richard Lawson, red-faced and ashamed, brought his hands together weakly. Helena raised her eyes for the first time in nearly an hour. Her voice cracked as she addressed the cabin. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I will earn your trust back not by asking for it, but by changing what I do when I leave this plane. That's the only promise I can make. Adrian turned toward her, his gaze steady. Then start by listening. Dignity is not given by uniforms or titles. It is owed to every human being before they even step onto this aircraft. Helena nodded, the words striking her like stones. She whispered, I hear you. The engines roared louder now, the plane inching forward toward the runway, but the passengers hardly noticed the motion. Their eyes remained on Adrian, their minds circling his words, their bodies carrying the tremors of what they had just witnessed. Ethan whispered again into his recorder. The most remarkable part of tonight is not the leverage, it is the restraint. He could have destroyed them, but he chose instead to rebuild them. That decision is what history will remember. Naomi lowered her phone slightly, exhaustion pressing into her. She smiled faintly into the camera. This isn't the end. It's the beginning. We'll see what they do with it. She ended the stream at last, the red light vanishing, leaving only the hum of the engines and the quiet pulse of thought in the cabin. Adrian leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. For a fleeting second, he allowed himself to feel the fatigue, the ache in his chest from carrying both the confrontation and its meaning. He thought of his daughter again, the way she had once asked why strangers looked at them differently in certain places. Tonight's events were not an answer, but perhaps they were a beginning. When he opened his eyes again, he looked not at Helena, not at Richard, not even at Naomi or Ethan, but at the passengers as a whole. Remember this night, he said softly, not because of me, but because you witnessed how systems shift, and when you are asked in your own lives to choose between silence and dignity, remember that one refusal can change everything. The words landed heavy. Some passengers nodded, others wiped quiet tears. All carried the weight of what they had seen. The plane turned slowly onto the runway, engines rising to a steady roar. For the first time since boarding, the cabin felt unified, not by destination, but by experience. They had been strangers hours ago. Now, they were witnesses to a precedent. As the aircraft began its roll, Adrian closed his eyes again. He did not smile. He did not sigh. He simply let the rumble of takeoff surround him, carrying not just a plane into the night sky, but the memory of accountability into a world that badly needed it. The aircraft leveled off smoothly, the seatbelt sign dimming with a soft chime. Flight 229 was finally in the air, but the cabin carried no sense of ordinary travel. The usual clink of glasses, the shuffle of seat adjustments, the small talk of strangers, none of it came. Instead, the silence was filled with something weightier, as though the altitude itself demanded reflection. Adrian Rhodes remained in his seat, his body upright, his gaze fixed on the horizon outside his window. Clouds drifted past in slow layers, a calm landscape masking the turbulence of the hours before. He breathed deeply, as though the cold air outside could seep through the pain and steady him. He thought of the call with Gregory Vaughn, of the CEO's voice stripped of its usual certainty.
Adrian had heard desperation before, but this was different. It was the tremor of a man who realized his empire could crumble in minutes. That realization weighed on Adrian, not because he regretted wielding his leverage, but because he understood how easily such power could corrupt, how temptation whispered not toward justice, but toward domination. He asked himself the same question he had asked silently during the standoff. Had he crossed a line, his conscience offered no easy answer. He knew the crew had been wrong, that the humiliation inflicted upon him had been both unjust and systemic. But the memory of freezing an entire airline's network, it gnawed at him. Did I do this for justice, he wondered, or did I do this to prove I could? The quiet self-interrogation pressed deep. Adrian had always prided himself on discipline, on keeping his anger leashed. But tonight, he had seen how quickly restraint could harden into action when provoked. He whispered under his breath, barely audible even to himself, I must never let fury wear the mask of reform. Across the aisle, Helena Park watched him, though she tried to avert her eyes whenever he turned his head. For the first time since her training days, she felt like a student again. The arrogance of authority had fallen away. Now, she was simply a woman facing the wreckage of her choices. She recalled her first years on the job, when she was eager, compassionate, convinced she was making flying safer for everyone. Somewhere along the line, rules had replaced empathy, checklists had replaced discernment, and suspicion had replaced trust. She remembered her mother's words once, spoken years ago. Power is easiest to abuse when you believe you're just doing your job. Helena pressed her palms together in her lap, a silent prayer that she had not learned that truth too late. Malcolm Ortiz sat stiff in his seat, unable to shake the image of himself standing silent as Helena pressed Adrian. He replayed it again and again the moment he crossed his arms, choosing the shield of neutrality. Shame burned in his chest. He had not insulted anyone directly, had not raised his voice, yet somehow his silence had cut deeper. He scribbled in the margins of a service manual tucked into his bag. Neutrality is betrayal. He underlined the words twice. Richard Lawson, once so proud in his tailored suit, shifted uncomfortably. He had built his life on boardrooms and contracts, on being the man whose voice carried weight in every meeting. Tonight, his voice had carried, but for the wrong reasons. He heard his earlier words. These cabins aren't for everyone echoing back with venom. He imagined his colleagues, his clients, his family watching Naomi's live stream replay. He imagined headlines with his name beneath them. His chest tightened with dread. But beneath the dread, a seed of something unexpected stirred. Guilt. Yes. But also a recognition that he had been given a rare chance to change. Few men were confronted with their ugliest reflections so publicly. Most carried their arrogance unchecked. He thought, perhaps for the first time in his life, maybe humiliation is the beginning of humility. Naomi Carter had finally lowered her phone. Her live stream had ended, but the notifications still exploded on her screen, hundreds per minute. Offers, interviews, praise it all flooded in. But Naomi didn't feel like a celebrity. She felt like someone who had stumbled into responsibility. She thought of the thousands of young people who would watch her shaky footage, who would point and say, that could be me holding the camera. It frightened her. The weight of witnesshood had become heavier than she expected. She whispered to the passenger beside her, I didn't just film a story tonight. I filmed a movement. The words frightened her, even as they excited her. Ethan Ward leaned forward in his seat, pen scratching furiously in his journal. He had filled 3 pages already, each sentence crafted with precision. But then
He paused, staring at a blank line, tapping his pen against the paper. Do I capture the facts, he thought, or do I capture the feeling? Facts were easy the time of the call, the conditions of the contract, the CEO's capitulation. Feeling was harder, the tremor in Helena's voice, the tears in Jasmine's eyes, the awe in Margaret's tone. Ethan pressed his pen down and wrote in bold strokes, "History is not written by facts alone. It is written by the heartbeat of those who witness it." Margaret Hill rested back, eyes half closed, remembering her own youth. She had marched once, long ago, for civil rights in her city. She remembered the fear, the chants, the quiet courage of standing in the street when others told her to stay home. Seeing Adrian tonight brought those memories rushing back. She whispered softly to herself, "The faces change, the methods change, but the struggle never does." Jasmine Lee stroked her infant's hair, heart pounding slower now, but still heavy. She thought of the world her child would inherit. Would tonight change anything? Would the policies Adrian demanded truly reshape the culture of the airline? Or would they be buried in bureaucracy once the headlines faded? She pressed her lips against her son's forehead and whispered, "I'll fight for you. If he can fight for dignity with the world watching, I can fight for yours, quietly, every day." Officer Grant Mercer lingered near the cockpit door, arms folded, his radio silent now. He thought of the countdown he had delivered earlier, the cold authority in his voice. 60 seconds to comply, he had said, as if Adrian were nothing more than a stubborn passenger. The shame of it coiled in his gut. He knew he had followed protocol. He also knew he had nearly handcuffed a man who had done nothing wrong. The realization sickened him. He muttered quietly, "Never again. Not like that. Not on my watch." Adrian remained silent, lost in thought. He imagined his daughter again, remembered the way she had once told him she was tired of being asked whether she really belonged at her school's science club. He thought of his father's lessons, how the man had told him that dignity is both shield and sword. Tonight, Adrian had wielded it as both, but he worried. Would she understand what he had done as justice, or would she see it as vengeance? He whispered to himself, may she inherit the courage without the burden. The cabin lights dimmed, casting a softer glow. Passengers shifted in their seats, some closing their eyes, others staring quietly ahead. But no one truly slept. The air was too heavy with reflection. Ethan finally looked up from his journal and said softly, as though narrating to the entire cabin, "We are flying at 30,000 feet, but it feels like we are floating somewhere between past and future. Tonight we saw what happens when someone refuses to be moved. The question for each of us is whether we will refuse too when our moment comes." No one answered him, but no one dismissed his words either. They lingered in the air, a final layer of reflection woven into the silence of the cabin. Adrian leaned back, his eyes closing again, his mind steadying at last. He knew this story would live beyond him, but in this moment, high above the clouds, he allowed himself a rare thought of peace. Justice was not finished, but for tonight, it had spoken. The captain's voice cut through the dim hush of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Dallas-Fort Worth. Please fasten your seatbelts and prepare for landing." The usual announcement, yet it carried a different weight tonight. The descent wasn't just into a city, it was into consequence. The passengers stirred slowly, almost reluctantly. Seatbelts clicked, trays locked, seats lifted upright. But unlike every other flight they had taken, no one treated these motions as routine. The gestures felt ceremonial, as if each click was part of an unspoken ritual sealing the memory of what they had endured together. Adrian Rhodes straightened his back, hands folded loosely on his lap. The soft vibration of the aircraft's descent filled his body. He had traveled countless times in cabins more luxurious than this, on flights more consequential to his career. But never had he stepped off a plane, knowing that the story of the journey itself would travel farther than he ever could. He looked across the aisle. Helena Park sat upright, her jaw set, her eyes, though weary, no longer hid from his. She held his gaze for a beat, then inclined her head slightly, a silent acknowledgement, not of forgiveness asked, but of accountability accepted. Malcolm Ortiz fidgeted with a pen in his hand, scribbling words on a notepad he had pulled from his bag. He was drafting what he told himself would become his own personal manifesto, a commitment that silence would never again be his shield. He underlined a phrase 3 times. Leadership begins with voice. Richard Lawson remained rigid, his face pale. He hadn't spoken in over an hour. The weight of his earlier arrogance sat heavy on him, heavier than the descent. He knew when the wheels touched down. His name would travel faster than the plane itself, carried on Naomi's stream and Ethan's words. His reputation might not survive this flight, but for the first time, he wondered if perhaps that wasn't punishment, but rebirth. Naomi Carter cradled her phone, notifications still flooding in though her stream was off. She scrolled through headlines, passenger forces, Skyreach Reform Live. The road's precedent. Live stream, at 30,000 feet sparks corporate reckoning. She whispered, almost to herself, I was just going to Dallas. How did I end up here? But a quiet pride steadied her hands. She had been more than a passenger. She had been a witness who refused to look away. Ethan Ward leaned against the window, scribbling final notes. He had already chosen his headline, Justice at Altitude. He paused, pen resting against the paper, then added a line beneath it. History is not where you expect it. Sometimes it boards at gate B-22. Margaret Hill closed her eyes, lips moving in silent prayer. For decades she had prayed for moments like this, for dignity to stand, for justice to speak. Tonight, at last, she had witnessed both. Jasmine Lee kissed her infant's forehead as the child stirred, restless with the descent. Someday, she whispered to him, you'll know you were here when history was written in a cabin. The landing gear groaned as it extended. The rumble echoed through the fuselage, and the plane shook slightly with the force of gravity reclaiming it. The runway lights flickered into view through the windows, streaks of white guiding the aircraft home. Adrian inhaled deeply, steadying himself. He knew the cameras would swarm the gate, that the airline would scramble to control the narrative. But he also knew the truth. The narrative was no longer theirs to control. Naomi's footage, Ethan's notes, Margaret's testimony, all of it lived beyond corporate spin. The wheels struck the tarmac with a jolt, and the cabin shook as brakes screamed against steel. Passengers braced themselves, but the sound felt less like arrival and more like punctuation, the end of a sentence too powerful to ignore. When the plane slowed to a crawl and turned toward the gate, the cabin filled with a strange silence. Usually passengers fumbled for bags, checked phones, sighed impatiently. Not tonight. Tonight they sat still, as though unwilling to break the sanctity of what they had shared. Finally, the seatbelt sign dinged off. The aisle lights glowed, yet still. No one rose. All eyes turned to Adrian. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, lifting his leather case from beneath his seat. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He turned to face the passengers one last time. His voice was steady, not loud, yet it carried to every corner of the cabin. You will leave this plane and return to your lives. But remember, this wasn't just about me. It was about what dignity costs and what silence protects. Don't forget what you saw. Don't forget what you felt. And when the moment comes for you to choose, remember, refusal can move mountains. The words lingered in the air like smoke, curling into the minds of each listener. Some nodded, others blinked back tears. A few whispered quiet affirmations. Helena whispered aloud, almost like a vow, "I won't forget." Malcolm echoed softly, "Nor will I." Naomi lifted her phone again, snapping one final photo, Adrian standing in the aisle, calm and resolute, framed by the soft glow of the cabin lights. She knew it would become iconic. The door opened with a metallic hiss. The jet bridge extended. Outside, the flashing lights of cameras and phones lit the glass. The airline had tried to contain the storm, but storms have a way of spilling beyond their walls. Adrian stepped forward, case in hand. As he reached the doorway, he paused. He turned once more, looking back into the cabin, into the faces of strangers who were no longer strangers. His eyes softened, and he offered a single nod. Then he stepped into the jet bridge, and the cabin exhaled as one. Margaret whispered softly, "We won't see another night like this again." Jasmine kissed her baby once more. Ethan closed his journal. Naomi tapped save on her phone. Helena pressed her palms together, silently promising herself redemption. Richard lowered his head, burdened by the weight of his own words. The cabin emptied slowly, each passenger carrying with them not just luggage, but the memory of justice at altitude. And when the last light flickered off, the aircraft sat quiet on the tarmac, an ordinary plane again, but those who had been inside knew the truth. This plane had carried more than passengers. It had carried a verdict. The plane touched down, but no one on board would ever see flying the same way again. What began as a single moment of prejudice, an attendant insisting a black man did not belong in first class, ended as a turning point for an entire industry. Dr. Adrian Rhodes didn't shout. He didn't beg. He didn't fold. With calm conviction, he revealed a truth that silenced arrogance and forced accountability at the highest level. Passengers left that night carrying more than luggage. They carried the memory of a man who turned humiliation into a mandate for change. They carried the weight of a question. What will you do when you witness injustice? Will you stay silent, or will you stand? This story is not only about an airline, it's about every space where power disguises itself as procedure, every moment when dignity is tested. It reminds us that silence is complicity, and that justice, real justice, can begin in the quiet refusal to be moved. To those who cheered, those who streamed, and those who simply watched, remember you too are witnesses, and witnesses shape history. If this story moved you, let it move through you. Share it, discuss it, carry it forward, because the fight for dignity doesn't end at 30,000 feet. It's waiting wherever we stand. Like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to Silent Defenders for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of what truly matters. The next story is already boarding. Will you be there